Hey crew, it's Pitt, and I am back with some more freedom. Today we're diving back into the Federalist Papers. We will be doing Federalist Papers number 26, 27, and 28 because they are all a group. This is an energetic investment into the future of our country. I do believe that by speaking this out loud and by you listening to it, we are investing energy into the founding documents of this country, the reasoning behind those founding documents, and the future of our country. With that being said, we're going to dive into the Federalist Papers number 26 because we left off at the Federal Papers number 25. The idea of restraining the legislative authority in regard to the common defense considered for the Independent Journal by Alexander Hamilton to the people of the state of New York. It was a thing hardly to be expected that in popular revolution the minds of men should stop at that happy mean which marks the salutary boundary between power and privilege. It combines the energy of government with the security of private rights. A failure in this delicate and important point is the great source of the inconveniences we experience, and if we are not cautious to avoid a repetition of the error in our future attempts to rectify and ameliorate our system, we may travel from one chimerical project to another. We may try change after change, but we shall never be likely to make any material change for the better. The idea of restraining the legislative authority in the means of providing for the national defense is one of those refinements which owe their origin to a zeal for liberty more ardent than enlightened. We have seen, however, that it is not thus far an extensive prevalency, that even in this country, where it made its first appearance, Pennsylvania and North Carolina are the only two states by which it has been in any degree patronized, and that all the others have refused to give it the least countenance, wisely judging that confidence must be placed somewhere, that the necessity of doing it is implied in the very act of delegating power, and that it is better to hazard the abuse of that confidence than to embarrass the government and endanger the public safety by impolitic restrictions on the legislative authority. The opponents of the proposed Constitution combat in this respect the general decision of America, and instead of being taught by experience the propriety of correcting any extremes into which we may have heretofore run, they appear disposed to conduct us into others still more dangerous and more extravagant, as if the tone of government had been found too high or too rigid. The doctrines they teach are calculated to induce us to depress or to relax it by expedients which, upon other occasions, have been condemned or forborne. It may be affirmed without the imputation of invective that if the principles they inculcate on various points could so far obtain as to become the popular creed, they would utterly unfit the people of this country for any species of government whatsoever. But a danger of this kind is not to be apprehended. The citizens of America have too much discernment to be argued into anarchy. And I am much mistaken if experience has not wrought a deep and solemn conviction in the public mind that greater energy of government is essential to the welfare and prosperity of the community. It may not be amiss in this place concisely to remark the origin and progress of the idea which aims at the exclusion of military establishments in time of peace. Though in speculative minds it may arise from a contemplation of the nature and tendency of such institutions, fortified by the events that have happened in other ages and countries, yet, as a national sentiment, it must be traced to those habits of thinking which we derive from the nation from whom the inhabitants of these states have in general sprung. In England, for a long time after the Norman Conquest, the authority of the monarch was almost unlimited. Inroads were gradually made upon the prerogative in favor of liberty, first by the barons, and afterwards by the people, till the greatest part of its most formidable pretensions became extinct. But it was not till the Revolution in 1688, which elevated the Prince of Orange to the throne of Great Britain, that English liberty was completely triumphant. As incident to the undefined power of making war an acknowledged prerogative to the crown, Charles II had, by his own authority, kept on foot in time of peace a body of 5,000 regular troops. And this number James II increased to 30,000, who were paid out of his civil list. At the Revolution, to abolish the exercise of so dangerous an authority, it became an article of the Bill of Rights, then framed that the raising or keeping a standing army within the kingdom in time of peace, unless with the consent of Parliament, was against the law. In that kingdom, when the pulse of liberty was at its highest pitch, no security against the danger of the standing armies was thought requisite, beyond a prohibition for their being raised or kept up by the mere authority of the executive magistrate. The patriots who effected that memorable revolution were too temperate, too well informed, to think of any restraint on the legislative discretion. They were aware that a certain number of troops for guards and garrisons were indispensable, that no precise bounds could be set to the national exigencies, that a power equal to every possible contingency must exist somewhere in the government, and that when they referred to the exercise of that power to the judgment of the legislature, they had arrived at the ultimate point of precaution, which was reconcilable with the safety of the community. From the same source, the people of America may be said to have derived a hereditary impression of danger to liberty from standing armies in times of peace. The circumstances of a revolution quickened the public sensibility on every point connected with the security of popular rights, and in some instances raised the warmth of our zeal beyond the degree which consisted with the due temperature of the body politic. The attempts of two of the states to restrict the authority of the legislature in the article of military establishments are of the number of these instances. The principles which had taught us to be jealous of the power of a hereditary monarch were by an injudicious excess extended to the representatives of the people in their popular assemblies. Even in some of the states where this error was not adopted, we find unnecessary declarations that standing armies not to be kept up in the time of peace without the consent of the legislature. I call them unnecessary because the reason which had introduced a similar provision into the English Bill of Rights is not applicable to any of the state constitutions. The power of raising armies at all under those constitutions can by no construction be deemed to reside anywhere else than in the legislatures themselves, and it was superfluous, if not absurd, to declare that a matter should not be done without the consent of a body which alone had the power of doing it. Accordingly, in some of these constitutions, and among others, in that of the state of New York, which has been justly celebrated both in Europe and America as one of the best forms of government established in this country, there is a total silence upon the subject. It is remarkable that even in the two states which seem to have meditated an interdiction of military establishments in time of peace, the mode of expression made use of is rather cautionary than prohibitory. It is not said that standing armies shall not be kept up, but that they ought not to be kept up in time of peace. This ambiguity in terms appears to have been the result of a conflict between jealousy and conviction, between the desire of excluding such establishments at all events, and the persuasion that an absolute exclusion would be unwise and unsafe. Can it be doubted that such a provision, whenever the situation of public affairs was understood to require a departure from it, would be interpreted by the legislature into a mere admonition, and would be made to yield the necessities or supposed necessities of the state? Let the fact already mentioned with respect to Pennsylvania decide. What then, it may be asked, is the use of such a provision, if it ceased to operate the moment there is an inclination to disregard it? Let us examine whether there be any comparison, in point of efficiency, between the provision alluded to and that which is contained in the new Constitution.
for restraining the appropriations of money for military purposes to the period of 2 years. The former by aiming at too much is calculated to effect nothing, the latter by steering clear of an imprudent extreme, and by being perfectly compatible with a proper provision for the exigencies of a nation, will have a salutary and powerful operation. The legislature of the United States will be obliged by this provision once, at least in every 2 years, to deliberate upon the propriety of keeping a military force on foot, to come to a new resolution on the point, and to declare their sense in the matter, by a formal vote in the face of their constituents. They are not at liberty to vest in the executive department permanent funds for the support of an army. If they were even incautious enough to be willing to repose in it so improper a confidence. As the spirit of party in different degrees must be expected to infect all political bodies, there will be, no doubt, persons in the national legislature willing enough to arraign the measures and criminate the views of the majority. The provision for the support of a military force will always be a favorable topic for declamation. As often as the question comes forward, the public attention will be roused and attracted to the subject by the party in opposition, and the majority should be really disposed to exceed the proper limits. The community will be warned of the danger and will have an opportunity of taking measures to guard against it. Independent of parties in the national legislature itself, as often as the period of discussion arrived, the state legislatures, who will always be not only vigilant but suspicious and jealous guardians of the rights of the citizens against encroachments from the federal government, will constantly have their attention awake to the conduct of the national rulers, and will be ready enough, if anything improper appears, to sound the alarm to the people, and not only to be the voice, but, if necessary, the arm of their discontent. Schemes to subvert the liberties of a great community require time to mature them for execution. An army so large as seriously to menace those liberties could only be formed by progressive augmentations, which would suppose not merely a temporary combination between the legislature and executive, but a continued conspiracy for a series of time. Is it probable that such a combination would exist at all? Is it probable that it would be persevered in and transmitted along through all the successive variations in a representative body, which biennial elections would naturally produce in both houses? Is it presumable that every man, the instant he took his seat in the National Senate or House of Representatives, would commence a traitor to his constituents and to his country? Can it be supposed that there would not be found one man discerning enough to detect so atrocious a conspiracy, or bold or honest enough to apprise his constituents of their danger? If such presumptions can fairly be made, there ought at once to be an end of all delegated authority. The people should resolve to recall all the powers they have heretofore parted without of their own hands, and to divide themselves into as many states as there are counties, in order that they may be able to manage their own concerns in person. If such suppositions are even could even be reasonably made, still the concealment of the design for any duration would be impracticable. It would be announced by the very circumstance of augmenting the army to so great of an extent in time of profound peace. What colorable reason could be assigned, in a country so situated, for such vast augmentations of the military force? Is it impossible that the people could be long deceived, and the destruction of the project and of the projectors would quickly follow the discovery? It has been said that the provision which limits the appropriation of money for the support of the army to the period of 2 years would be unavailing, because the executive, when once possessed of a force large enough to awe the people into submission, would find resources in that very force sufficient to enable him to dispense with supplies from the act of the legislature. But the question again recurs, upon what pretense could he be put in possession of a force of that magnitude in time of peace. If we suppose it to have been created in consequence of some domestic insurrection or foreign war, then it becomes a case not within the principles of the objection, for this is leveled against the power of keeping up troops in a time of peace. Few persons will be so visionary as to seriously to contend that military forces ought not to be raised to quell a rebellion or resist an invasion. And if the defense of the community under such circumstances should make it necessary to have an army so numerous as to hazard its liberty, this is one of those calamities for which there is neither preventative nor cure. It cannot be provided against by any possible form of government. It might even result from a simple league, offensive and defensive, if it should ever be necessary for the Confederates or Allies to form an army for common defense. But it is an evil infinitely less likely to attend to us in a united than in a disunited state. Nay, it may be safely asserted that it is an evil altogether unlikely to attend us in the latter situation. It is not easy to conceive a possibility that dangers so formidable can assail the whole Union as to demand a force considerable enough to place our liberties in the least jeopardy, especially if we take into our view the aid to be derived from the militia, which ought always to be counted upon as a valuable and powerful auxiliary. But in a state of disunion, as has been shown in another place, the contrary of this supposition would become not only probable, but almost avoidable. And so ends Federalist number 26. And here we see the safeguards that are supposed to be in place to protect us from the military being used upon us. We have posse comitatus, which means that the government cannot use the standing army upon its own people. That can be disregarded in times of insurrection or rebellion, and that is a good thing. Now, we haven't had an instance of a true insurrection in probably 100 years, although that's probably going to set some people into the tizzy, but it is true. There have been some singular actors who have done singular things, but even the military was denied in those points, even though it was clearly offered by the president in power. It was offered in defense of the cities prior to the events being said, and that is not an insurrection. If you are offered the means to protect yourself, nobody was intending to take over. But we do have a problem here. We do have outlined here the safeguard that is supposed to protect us from the standing army ever being a possibility to be used, and that is that the legislature is supposed to be held to account, and it is not. That is, again, us eschewing our responsibilities to say that somebody else needs to be responsible for these decisions, and simply because they have the correct letter behind their name, I'm going to support that, even though they are entirely against what I actually stand for. We have decided not to do research as a citizen in order to ensure that these things never happen. This was very valid fears. There was a reason why people were arguing against a standing army. Because for the history of forever, the standing army has been used against the people in times of trouble. That is a true thing. And it is important for us to maintain our vigilance. As we elect our representatives, they are supposed to have a high turnover. They're not supposed to be there for an entire career. They're supposed to take time from their current occupation to briefly serve in service of the country as a whole, but their constituents and in particular, right? My representative should not be representing Mississippi's interest or Texas interest. It should be Louisiana interest. That's not to say that it should be exclusive, because our greater good is absolutely for everyone's benefit, but our interest locally from the constituency should be the priority, and if it is not, it is our responsibility to ensure that they are removed. Otherwise, you have an eternal state apparatus which is neither right nor left, but instead of a uniparty nature, which keeps us perpetually at war, despite the best interests of the United States. That is a problem that we have given, right? We have caused our own problem by abdicating our responsibility as citizens to ensure that our government is doing what we tell it to. That's up to us, not them. Their service is entirely at our whim. They should know of them. None of them should be there for longer than 2 terms, but that shouldn't be a law. That should be a thing that we see to. Because there might be somebody that needs 3, right? We shouldn't make a law like that. All right, Federalist paper number 27. The same subject continued from the New York Packet, December 25th, 1787, Christmas Day. Alexander Hamilton to the people of the state of New York. It has been urged in different shapes that a constitution of the kind proposed by the convention cannot operate without the aid of a military force to execute its laws. This, however, like most other things that have been alleged on that side, rests on a mere general assertion, unsupported by any pretense or intelligible designations to the reasons upon which it is founded. As far as I have been able to divine the latent meaning of the objectors, it seems to originate in a presupposition that the people will be disinclined to the exercise of a federal authority in any matter of an internal nature, waiving any exception that might be taken to the inaccuracy or inexplicitness of the distinction between internal and external. Let us inquire what ground there is to presuppose that disinclination in the people, unless we presume at the same time that the powers of the general government will be worse administered than those of the state government. There seems to be no room for the presumption of ill will, disaffection, or opposition in the people. I believe it may be laid down as a general rule that their confidence in and obedience to a government will commonly be proportioned to the goodness or badness of its administration. It must be admitted that there are exceptions to this rule, but these exceptions depend so entirely on accidental causes that they cannot be considered as having any relation to the intrinsic merits or demerits of a constitution. These can only be judged by general principles and maxims. Various reasons have been suggested in the course of these papers to induce a probability that the general government will be better administered than the particular governments, the principal of which reasons are that the extension of the spheres of election will present a greater option or latitude of choice to the people, that through the medium of the state legislatures, which are select bodies of men, and which are here to appoint the members of the National Senate, there is reason to expect that this branch will generally be composed with peculiar care and judgment, that these circumstances promise greater knowledge and more extensive information in the national councils, and then they will be less apt to be tainted by the spirit of faction, and more out of the reach of these occasional ill humors or temporary prejudices and propensities, which, in smaller societies, frequently contaminate the public councils, beget injustice and oppression of a part of the community, and engender schemes which, though they gratify a momentary inclination or desire, terminate in general distress, dissatisfaction, and disgust. Several additional reasons of considerable force to fortify that probability will occur when we come to survey with a more critical eye the interior structure of the edifice which we are invited to erect. It will be sufficient here to remark that until satisfactory reasons can be assigned to justify an opinion that the federal government is likely to be administered in such a manner as to render it odious or contemptible to the people, there can be no reasonable foundation for the supposition that the laws of the Union will meet with any greater obstruction from them, or will stand in need of any other methods to enforce their execution than the laws of the particular members. The hope of impunity is a strong incitement to sedition, the dread of punishment a proportionally strong discouragement to it. Will not the government of the Union, which, if possessed of a due degree of power, can call to its aid the collective resources of the whole Confederacy, be more likely to repress the former sentiment and to inspire the latter than that of a single state, which can only command the resources within itself? A turbulent faction in a state may easily suppose itself able to contend with the friends to the government in that state, but it can hardly be so infatuated as to imagine itself a match for the combined efforts of the Union. If this reflection be just, there is less danger of resistance from irregular combinations of individuals to the authority of the Confederacy than to that of a single member. I will, in this place, hazard an observation, which will not be the less just because of some it may appear new, which is, that the more the operations of the national authority are intermingled with the ordinary exercise of government, the more the citizens are accustomed to meet with it in the common occurrences of their political life. The more it is familiarized to their sight and to their feelings, the further it enters into those objects which touch the most sensible chords and put into motion the most active springs of the human heart, the greater will be the probability that it will conciliate the respect and attachment of the community. Man is very much a creature of habit. A thing that rarely strikes his senses will generally have but little influence upon his mind. A government continually at a distance and out of sight can hardly be expected to interest the sensations of the people. The inference is that the authority of the Union and the affections of the citizens towards it will be strengthened rather than weakened by its extension to what are called matters of internal concern, and will have less occasion to recur in force in proportion to the familiarity and comprehensiveness of its agency. The more it circulates through those channels and currents in which the passions of mankind naturally flow, the less it will require the aid of the violent and perilous expedients of compulsion. One thing, at all events, must be evident, that a government like the one proposed would bid much fairer to avoid the necessity of using force than that species of league contended for by most of its opponents, the authority of which should only operate upon the states in their political or collective capacities. It has been shown that in such a confederacy there can be no sanction for the laws but force, that frequent delinquencies in the members are the natural offspring of the very frame of the government, and that as often as these happen, they can only be redressed, if at all, by war and violence. The plan reported by the convention, by extending the authority of the federal head to the individual citizens of the several states, will enable the government to employ the ordinary magistracy of each in the execution of its laws. It is easy to perceive that this will tend to destroy, in the common apprehension, all distinction between the sources from which they might proceed, and will give the federal government the same advantage for securing a due obedience to its authority which is enjoyed by the government of each state, in addition to the influence on public opinion which will result from the important considerations of its having power to call on to its assistance and support the resources of the whole Union. It merits particular attention in this place that the laws of the Confederacy, as to the enumerated and legitimate objects of its jurisdiction, will become the supreme law of the land, to the observance of which all officers, legislative, executive, and judicial, in each state will be bound by the sanctity of an oath. Thus, the legislatures, courts, and magistrates of the respective members will be incorporated into the operations of the national government, as far as it is just and constitutional authority extends, and it will be rendered auxiliary to the enforcement of its laws. Any man who will pursue, by his own reflections, the consequences of this situation, will perceive that there is good ground to calculate upon regular and peaceable execution of the laws of the Union, if its powers are administered with a common share of prudence. If we will arbitrarily suppose the contrary, We may deduce any inferences we please from the supposition, for it is certainly possible, by an injudicious exercise of the authorities of the best government that ever was or ever can be instituted, to provoke and precipitate the people into the wildest excesses. But though the adversaries of the proposed Constitution should presume that the national rulers would be insensible to the motives of public good or to the obligations of duty, I would still ask them how the interests of ambition or the views of encroachment can be promoted by such conduct. And so we finished with Federalist number 27. And this one was really just an argument that it is through the proper procedures placed in that we have the guarantee of a turnover, right? We are to go every 2 years and hold elections for our elected representatives. And we go every 6 years now for the other ones. But at this point in time, all free and land-owning people were expected to not only vote, but have an informed vote to ensure that the people they are voting for are doing the things that they're supposed to do. And that is our safeguard. It is up to us as citizenry to recognize the dangers as they appear and to call them out loudly and proudly. It's the reason we have the First Amendment, so that when the government gets off track, we can say, hey, you're doing the wrong shit. It is so we can say as citizens that this is unacceptable and to give us the means to remove those people. Now, we, again, have largely abdicated the responsibility. We have largely shunted off that power to different political parties and to different pundits so that they can tell us what's the best for us. But that's not how it's supposed to be. We, as citizens, are supposed to be recognizing the people in our general spheres who are leaders and to require them to, on occasion, give up their own pursuits for the national benefit. They are supposed to be convinced by us that the need is so great for honest men to stand in office that we need you to give up your livelihood. And we will compensate you, probably not to the same degree, but we will compensate you for your time and your sacrifice to the country, because you are the example that we should be looking to. You are a successful businessman who treats people equally and equitably, both, and who seeks first the dominion of the Union and the benefit for its citizenry, as opposed to your own personal benefit. That is our responsibility. It goes along with our rights. You have the right to scream. You have the right to arm yourself. You have the right to not let anyone in your house. But without the responsibilities that go along with that right, you might as well just piss in the fucking yard. You're doing nothing. If you are abdicating your responsibility to be an educated voter, it is better if you do not vote. And I don't like saying that because I want everybody to vote. I want everybody to be informed and to vote in their own interest. That is a real thing. I want you to vote for what is best for you. Not what is best for the party, but what is best for you. Because what is best for you will probably be what is best for the country as well. And it is our responsibility to grab those reins of responsibility and to walk into our greater purpose with vigor, wanting the responsibility, wanting to be the example. That is who we are called to be. That is who we should be as a nation. Now let's get into Federalist Paper number 28. The same subject continued for the Independent Journal, Alexander Hamilton to the people of the state of New York. That there may happen cases in which the national government may be necessitated to resort to force cannot be denied. Our own experience has corroborated the lessons taught by the examples of other nations that emergencies of this sort will sometimes arise in all societies, however constituted, that seditions and insurrections are, unhappily, maladies as inseparable from the body politic as tumors and eruptions from the natural body, that the idea of governing at all times by the simple force of law which we have been told is the only admissible principle of a republican government, has no place but in the reveries of those political doctors whose sagacity disdains the admonitions of experimental instruction. Should such emergencies at any time happen under the national government, there could be no remedy but force. The means to be employed must be proportioned to the extent of the mischief. If it should be a slight commotion in a small part of a state, the militia of the residue would be adequate to its suppression, and the national presumption is that they would be ready to do their duty. An insurrection, whatever may be its immediate cause, eventually endangers all government. Regard to the public peace, if not to the rights of the Union, would engage the citizens to whom the contagion had not communicated itself to oppose the insurgents. And if the general government should be found in practice conducive to the prosperity and felicity of the people, it were irrational to believe that they would be disinclined to its support. If, on the contrary, the insurrection should pervade a whole state or a principal part of it, the employment of a different kind of force might become unavoidable. It appears that Massachusetts found it necessary to raise troops for repressing the disorders within that state. That Pennsylvania, from the mere apprehension of commotions among a part of her citizens, has thought proper to have recourse to the same measure. Suppose the state of New York had been inclined to reestablish her lost jurisdiction over the inhabitants of Vermont. Could she have hoped for success in such an enterprise from the efforts of the militia alone? Would she not have been compelled to raise and to maintain a more regular force for the execution of her design? If it must then be admitted that the necessity of recurring to a force different from the militia in cases of this extraordinary nature, it is applicable to the state governments themselves. Why should the possibility that the national government might be under a like necessity in similar extremities be made an objection to its existence? Is it not surprising that men who declare an attachment to the Union in the abstract should urge as an objection to the proposed Constitution what applies with tenfold weight to the plan for which they contend? And what, as far as any foundation in truth, is an inevitable consequence of civil society upon an enlarged scale? Who would not prefer that the possibility to the unceasing agitations and frequent revolutions which are continual scourges of petty republics? Let us pursue this examination in another light. Suppose, in lieu of one of the general system, 2 or 3 or even 4 confederacies were to be formed. Would not the same difficulty oppose itself to the operations of either of these confederacies? Would not each of them be exposed to the same casualties? And when these happen, to be obliged to have recourse to the same expedients for upholding its authority which are objected to in a government for all the states? Would the militia, in this supposition, be more ready or more able to support the federal authority than in the case of a general union? All candid and intelligent men must, upon due consideration, acknowledge that the principle of the objection is equally applicable to either of the 2 cases, and that whether we have one government for all the states or different governments for different parcels of them, or even if there should be an entire separation of the states, there might sometimes be a necessity to make use of a force constituted differently from the militia, to preserve the peace of the community and to maintain the just authority of the laws against those violent invasions of them which amount to insurrections and rebellions. Independent of all other reasonings upon the subject, it is a full answer to those who require a more peremptory provision against military establishments in the time of peace to say that the whole power of the proposed government is to be in the hands of the representatives of the people. This is essential, and, after all, only a facious security for the rights and privileges of the people which is attainable in a civil society. If the representatives of the people betray their constituents, then there is no resource left but the exertion of that original right of self-defense, which is paramount to all positive forms of government, and which, against the usurpations of the national rulers, may be exerted with infinitely better prospect of success than against those of the different parcels, subdivisions, or districts of which it consists. Right, against those of the rulers of an individual state. In a single state, if the persons entrusted with supreme power become usurpers, the different parcels, subdivisions, or districts of which it consists, having no distinct government in each, can take no regular measures for defense. The citizens must rush tumultuously to arms, without concert, without system, without resource, except in their courage and despair. The usurpers, clothed with the forms of legal authority, can too often crush the opposition in embryo. The smaller the extent of the territory, the more difficult will it be for the people to form a regular or systemic plan of opposition, and the more easy it will be to defeat their early efforts. Intelligence can be more speedily obtained of their preparations and movements, and the military force in the possession of the usurpers can be more rapidly directed against the part where the opposition has begun. In this situation, there must be a peculiar coincidence of circumstances to ensure success to the popular resistance. The obstacles to usurpation and the facilities of resistance increase with the increased extent of the state, provided the citizens understand their rights and are disposed to defend them. The natural strength of the people in a large community, in proportion to the artificial strength of the government, is greater than in a small, and of course more competent to a struggle with the attempts of the government to establish a tyranny. But in a confederacy, the people, without exaggeration, may be said to be entirely the masters of their own fate, power being almost always the rival of power. The general government will, at times, stand ready to check the usurpations of the state governments, and these will have the same disposition towards the general government. The people, by throwing themselves into either scale, will infallibly make it preponderate. If their rights are invaded by either, they can make use of the other as the instrument of redress. How wise will it be in them, by cherishing the union, to protect themselves an advantage which can never be too highly prized. It may safely be received as an axiom in our political system that the state governments will, in all possible contingencies, afford complete security against invasions of the public liberty by the national authority. Projects of usurpation cannot be masked under pretenses so likely to escape the penetration of select bodies of men as of the people at large. The legislatures will have better means of information. They can discover the danger at a distance, and, possessing all the organs of civil power and the confidence of the people, they can at once adopt a regular plan of opposition, in which they can combine all the resources of the community. They can readily communicate with each other in the different states and unite their common forces for the protection of their common liberty. The great extent of the country is a further security. We have already experienced its utility against the attacks of a foreign power, and it would have precisely the same effect against the enterprises of ambitious rulers in the national councils. If the federal army should be able to quell the resistance of one state, the distant states would have in their power to make head with fresh forces. The advantages obtained in one place must be abandoned to subdue the opposition in others. And the moment the part which had been reduced to submission was left to itself, its efforts would be renewed and its resistance revived. We should recollect that the extent of the military force must, at all events, be regulated by the resources of this country. For a long time to come, it will not be possible to maintain a large army, and, as the means of doing this increase, the population and natural strength of the community will proportionably increase. When will the time arrive that the federal government can raise and maintain an army capable of erecting a despotism over the great body of people with an immense empire, who are in a situation, through the medium of their state governments, to take measures for their own defense, with all the celerity, regularity, and system of independent nations. The apprehension may be considered as a disease for which there can be found no cure in the resources of an argument and reasoning. And so we wrap up Federalist Paper number 28, in which we are arguing again about the checks and balances that the populace holds against the government. The government exists completely at our will. It is completely at the will of the people that we allow government to happen. The fact that we are in a period of relative peace, and I understand that we are currently involved in wars, and we should not be, in my estimation, involved in most of them, but we are still living in a relative peace. There are not a whole lot of violent actions by the government against us. That is not normal throughout history. There are currently protests taking place across the country, and for the large part, they have been allowed to continue because they have been peaceful. Now, there have been seizures of property, and that is against the law. You don't get to do that. There have been the curtailing of other people's rights, and again, you don't get to do that, even as part of your protest. You don't get to stop me from my free interaction with my daily business. I have the right to defend myself against that, as a matter of fact. But you have the right to be mad. You have the right to scream and cry and be whatever you want, no matter how ignorant you may be in that. There are people out there actually arguing for communism. How silly is that? People actually arguing for racial segregation. How silly is that? But the best defense against that is an informed populace. It is us taking the responsibility for our own lives, for us making sure that we are responsible for the direction that this country is going to go in. We can either give oil to the squeaky wheel, or we can replace it with a wheel that doesn't squeak. Right? We can, through education, teach people that communism doesn't work, that racial segregation is completely stupid. We can do that, but it requires us, everyone, taking on responsibility. And I say everyone, knowing full well that it will not be everyone. People are lazy. People will, by and large, continue to be lazy. But for every single person who takes on the responsibility, the knowledge increases. For everyone who is speaking aloud the values and the principles that we hold, it becomes stronger. We can allow them to scream, and we can scream ourselves. And by screaming ourselves, we reinforce the things that we believe in, just as much as them screaming tears down the things that we believe in. They are building their reality, and then it's up to us to create our own. Now, we can try to do something completely different. I don't believe it'll work, but we could try that. We could try anarcho-capitalism. It has 0% chance of working. We can try disbanding the government or breaking into smaller pieces, but it again has a 0% chance of working. The only reason that freedom is a thing is because we have stood united for it. Even through the oppression of an entire half of a country. That is a thing. When there was the separation from the war between the states, that was a completely legal thing. They had the legal authority, according to the Constitution, to choose their own method of governance. And we enforced upon them, and I say we because my Southern ancestors were part of the Union, we enforced upon them that they didn't get to do what they wanted to do with their own lives. That is a big step for this country, but it has increased freedom across the globe in a very real way. We have, after that action, allowed more people to be part of the governance of our communities, but we have not required education. We have instead vilified education. People who are intelligent are made fun of. People who have taken the time to research things for themselves are made fun of. And that is silly. The whole point of our system is the fact that it is answerable to us regularly with power. We just have to realize that power and to take it for ourselves. We have to decide collectively that we are going to stand for the reasons why we have a union in the first place. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a not too difficult topic. This isn't hard. This isn't hard. If you read through this, it explains itself very well. I believe that me reading it aloud and you listening is an energetic investment. I believe in that. I believe in the power of manifestation, and speaking things out loud makes them happen. It is easier to build positive than it is to build negative, believe it or not. And if we have people acting in concert, either by speaking it or by listening to it, we are strengthening the foundations upon which we are built. That is the point of this. I know nobody's watching this, right? I have like maybe one person, hey Dirk, who's going to watch this to the end, and that's cool. But regardless, I'm going to continue investing my energy into my union that I fought for. I had 2 combat deployments, right? I was in the Navy. I went overseas twice to defend what we stand for. I stand by that today, and I will stand by that forever. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete just the way that you are. And this has been Pitt's Take. Peace.